Hey Connor, good to. I will wait till you put it away.
Here, let me pour myself a coffee as well.
Let me know when you're ready. This will be the intro, just Connor making some nice French press coffee. What beans are you using?
So these, so oftentimes I've been going for this company called Equator,
Mhm.
which is like a local company that just makes excellent coffee. And so I'm not sure if these are the drenched the Equator beans or if this is something else.
Have you tried Purity?
Oh, I have tried that before. It's good. It's really good.
Yeah, they claim to be like the healthiest one in terms of like all the numbers for like chlorogenic acids and trigenolins and like the good stuff you want to have in coffee.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Um, cool. Yeah, I'm ready whenever you are.
Hey Connor, really good to have you back on the interview on the YouTube. It's been a while since we last met. How are you doing? How's your morning so far?
Things are great. Yeah. So for context, yeah, I'm in the Bay Area. You're in Switzerland, and so it's what evening your time, and then morning my time. So far, the morning's off to a good start. But yeah, thank you for having me back. Yeah, I had a lot of fun the last time we chatted, and yeah, I'm happy to be back.
Nice, yeah. So we did an interview a couple of months ago, and actually last year we also met in person um, in California, in San Francisco. While I was on my California and Sedona trip, I still have to make the video about that because it was pretty awesome. And we went first time, we went skydiving. My first time and your 420th time, you told me. What a coincidence. And yeah, how many jumps do you got now and what's going on in your skydiving world these days?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, so since you were out here, I haven't jumped that much, so I might have maybe another 40 or so skydives. And then I forget exactly when you were out here, but that was about the time that I was getting into base jumping as well.
Mhm.
And so that was new as of this past season. And so now I think I have maybe about 50 base jumps, which in base jump numbers is relatively low. And
Mhm.
so I'm still very new to that sport. But I started getting into that last season, and it's been a tremendous amount of fun.
Yeah, what made you go into base jumping?
Well, I was having this back and forth. So, in terms of parachute sports, the three main sports within that arena are skydiving, base jumping, and paragliding. And
Mhm.
maybe you can add speed flying to that as well, which is kind of a hybrid between, a style of skydiving and paragliding, let's say. But I just got really enamored by the element of precision to base jumping because you just take your margins, which, with skydiving, they're maybe this big, and you shrink them down to about this big.
Mhm.
And so when you base jump, you have one single parachute. So you don't have a backup parachute. And just everything takes place in a much more narrow time frame. And so
Mhm.
I just became so enamored by the precision associated with that, and just like the complexity of what can happen in just a second or just a few seconds. That just I don't know, completely seduced me in, and so I started doing that. I took a base jumping course with the most accomplished base jumper in the world, somebody who has well over 6,000 base jumps at this point. um, just somebody who I have an enormous amount of respect for. And so I was
What's his
lucky
name?
enough. Sean Shuma is his name. And
Mhm.
so he's a specialist in a form of base jumping called aerials. And so he has a background in gymnastics and pole vaulting. And so he knows how to manipulate his body um, in a very tight time frame. And so he's effectively combining gymnastics back with base jumping in a way that's just absolutely phenomenal. Some of the stuff that he's able to achieve is just mind boggling. And so I was lucky enough to take his course last season, and then hopefully I'll be going actually not far from you, and either Italy or the Swiss Alps this coming season. And so I'm hoping to do a trip with him this season.
When we went skydiving, you actually told me that when you jump out, you like from 13,000 feet, I think you have like these 45 or 60 seconds of free fall. But when you're experienced, you told me like you can feel it like way slower, like it feels like more time that you actually have in free fall. How's the subjective feeling of falling out of the airplane versus doing base jumping in terms of time?
It's completely different, right? Like, so that time dilation is a function of flow, right? And so, like, you can think about time in two different ways, right? One is objective time, and that's, the time that you and I use to communicate to one another. That's the time that we use to run scientific experiments and whatever else. And so we've all kind of convened on, generally what a second is, generally what a minute is, and what have you. But subjective time operates so much differently. And so it's a function of your attention at the end of the day. And so if your attention is, entirely focused on the present moment, then like the experience of that time just extends drastically. And so with skydiving, an average skydive might seem like it's, 3 or 4 minutes in what's actually 45 seconds to a minute worth of free fall. With base jumping, I don't know if I could put a number on that because some of those jumps, like time just seems to almost completely stand still. And so like it's like that same framework of trying to match up your subjective experience to minutes and days and hours and whatever else is no longer fully applicable there. And so it's very hard to put some sort of number on that. Because I've had experiences base jumping where you jump off an object and then it seems like time is just frozen for a period of time. And so let's see, it's basketball athletes that call this the forever box. And so I like forever box is kind of a weird way of describing it. But it wasn't until, I started base jumping that I actually felt like I was jumping directly into the forever box. And then all of a sudden time is just operating in a very, very different way.
Wow, that sounds pretty interesting.
It's fun. I wouldn't recommend it. I'm not recommending it. However.
Sweet. Yeah, let me know when you come to Switzerland and you do your base jumping here.
I would love to, yeah.
I was recently doing also my first time paragliding, actually last week. My girlfriend and I, we went to the Swiss Alps in the canton of Valais. It's close to Lake Geneva. And we were in this place called White Pot. It's like an eco luxury thing where you sleep in kind of like tents. They call it pots. They have like these round shapes and you have like your own tent, so to speak, your own pot. It was pretty nice in powder snow, and you have to like walk up like 20 minutes in snowshoes from the parking spot to get up to your place. There's like no street to it. Pretty serene. And then we did some paragliding, like with a paragliding pilot.
Keep bending up, keep bending up. Whoa, whoa,
woo! That was beautiful. It really reminded me also of skydiving, like the last part when you fly around. And I could also like steer it. And it was so much fun because they can make like this kind of like roller coaster thing that you can also do with parachuting at the end, where you just go down like really fast and you make some curves and feel like the G-force. That was fun. I was like laughing for like 10 minutes straight. I got like so many neurochemicals in my brain. It was so much fun.
That's fantastic. I mean, yeah, like that way of interacting with your environment, especially when you're in the mountains, is just so special and so hard to describe. Yeah, paragliding is just, I don't know, it's a very beautiful, very slow paced sport in a lot of ways. And so I had a few different paragliding experiences, but then, I started wanting to go the opposite direction. I started wanting to go to something faster rather than something that was slower. But like with paragliding, I mean, you can just have all of your gear hike to the top of a mountain, like, throw yourself off the mountain and fly back down. And it's just such a wonderful way of being able to interact with your natural environment.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And definitely want to try it out more again. I also want to go skydiving again. Thank you so much for doing this first skydive with me.
That was a ton of fun. That was absolutely fun.
That was absolutely fun. So last time we talked also about CBD and Ojai Energetics. You actually mentioned Ojai Energetics in our first interview. And I also got the CBD and interviewed Will Cleeden. Super interesting person, super interesting company. And yeah, I really enjoy the product, the full spectrum hemp elixir they're doing. And you guys at Flow Research Collective, you're doing a collaboration with them in terms of CBD research. Please tell us about the collaboration and maybe if you can already share what's going on right now with that.
Yeah, so I actually do have exciting news about this. And so for a long time, this was stuck in academic quagmire. Um, and now we're finally out of that stage. And so just for context, the original study that we proposed with Ojai Energetics was looking at how CBD affects your ability to get into flow. And so we're looking specifically at professional surfers. And so the larger hypothesis is, if you think about three different dimensions of that equation, one would be that CBD would increase the speed with which you can get into flow. And so technically what's happening there is, in terms of the flow cycle, in terms of how you actually get into flow, people oftentimes get locked into struggle. And so the idea is that CBD is able to reduce the amount of cognitive load that you're experiencing, increase the amount of anandamide in your blood. It's changing the way that you're processing dopamine. And so between those three factors, it would increase the speed with which you can get into flow. So that's one aspect of the hypothesis. Then we're looking at whether it increases the length of time that you spend in flow and the depth of flow that you experience. And so what we're looking at studying with these surfers is how is CBD able to, increase the amount of flow that you receive, basically, and broken down into those three main ways of describing it. And so we've been working on this study for a number of months now. And so for anybody who's done, academic research before, this involves a number of different ethical reviews before you're able to actually move forward with those studies. And that is a somewhat of a tenuous thing, given the status of CBD in the US. And so as of, let's see, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, we finally got our IRB approval to move forward with the study. And so that took a tremendous amount of back and forth with working with different institutions that have varying degrees of knowledge when it comes to these tools. And so a lot of what you're concerned about when it comes to these ethical reviews are, what's the safety profile of what you're doing, right? Like you're giving people CBD and you're putting them on a surfboard, right? Like, is that a safe thing to do? Is this the best target population to be working with? Should you be working with a different population as well? And so we're just like fielding all of these questions for months. And so we're finally through that stage. And so that's going to be the first of many studies. And so for that one in particular, that's a double-blind placebo-controlled study. And so we have an active placebo that we'll be giving surfers, and we have a full-spectrum hemp product as well that we'll be giving them. And then we'll be looking at the differences between those two groups and how they experience flow. We'll also be layering in some attentional metrics as well. And so we'll be looking at, speed tests and different things to help quantify how this is oscillating their attentional functions.
Wow, super interesting.
It should be fun. It should be a lot of fun. And like, I don't know, it's like a lot of what the work that I do is, in Silicon Tech, which is just at like a blitz of a speed, right? And then you go into academia and you're just dealing with things on such a slower cycle. And so it's been a huge adjustment to try and, like move these things forward. But now we actually have quite a bit of momentum for us. And so I'm really excited about it.
Nice. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to, those outcomes from the study. Super interesting. What is your own experience with CBD? Do you use it to just subjectively to get into flow faster, or for what do you use it at all?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I use it in a more like typical way. And so the three main things that draw people to CBD are help with their sleep, pain management, and stress and anxiety. And so I have been using it recently to help manage my sleep. And so it does actually have, subjectively, I found that this has quite a substantial impact on my sleep. So I'll use it in that capacity. And then I'll also use it to manage stress. And so if I find that I'm, a little bit too activated, I'll use it in order to help bring myself down to a more manageable level.
Mm-hmm. How do you use it then? Like, what's your intake techniques, so to say, your dosage?
Yes. So sleep-wise, I usually do 2 to 3 dropperfuls, which I think winds up being maybe 75 milligrams. Mm-hmm. And then that's one way of dosing this. Another way of dosing this, which is really, really interesting, and we haven't fully validated this, but this has to do with the way that you process bitter and sweet. And so I can't remember if we discussed this before, but basically the way that you process bitter and sweet is a function and part of your endocannabinoid system. And if you're using a water-soluble CBD, that's affecting you pretty quickly, on the order of seconds. You can actually use the way that it tastes as a proxy for where you are in the dose curve. And so if you think about like the way that these dose curves work, the more of a given substance that you take means that you have more of an effect up into a certain point, and then it starts to go down. And so with like the pharmacokinetics of, many different substances, CBD included, you have like this oscillating curve of, the amount of effect that you receive versus the dose. And so you're kind of looking for like, what is the maximum effect that you can have? And when you're at like the top of that bell curve, the CBD will actually taste like honey. It'll taste quite sweet. And when you're at the bottom of it, it'll taste bitter. And so what you're looking at doing is titrating it, right? So taking maybe a quarter of a dropper full at a time, seeing how it tastes, and then taking, a little bit more until it tastes sweet. And then you're stopping after that. Because a lot of people think like, oh, if I just take more and more and more, I'll continue to have added effects. And that's not quite the way that your body processes it.
Right, so you have that peak point at the top of the bell curve. And I found it so interesting that it's basically a smart product that tells you like when you have the maximum dosage. That's pretty mind-blowing, I find.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating, right? Because in any domain of cannabis, you talk a lot about terpenes, right? And so terpenes are in part responsible for, the way that things smell. And so one thing that we've been looking at is how, like, if you were to take a little bit of CBD, and then you were to smell something, depending on what it is that you're smelling, that's effectively acting like a rudder that's determining how that CBD is processed within your system.
Yeah. Will talked about that in the interview that I did with him. Pretty interesting.
Exactly. And like, I'm on like tenuous territory here because, Will talks about this all the time, and like, this is his area specialty. And this is something that like, I'm still like, a little bit skeptical of. But to make it insanely concrete, you can take some CBD and then immediately afterwards smell peppermint. And so like the terpenes in peppermint are going to affect the delivery of that such that it increases focus, is Will's claim. And so I had a wonderful conversation with him yesterday, and then, ordered all of these essential oils afterwards to try to experiment with it and see how effective it is. And so peppermint is one thing that you can use for that. And then lemongrass is one that you can use to help leverage the anti-inflammatory and sedative qualities.
It would be so interesting to have a real study on that, to really find out like some hard facts of what works with the essential oils and the CBD. Because I've been trying out some stuff too after the interview I did with Will, but yeah, I couldn't figure out like anything that works like all the time. But so it would be interesting to get some guidance, like a manual, really, where I know, okay, this works, this combination.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's some of the stuff I'm really skeptical of. And so, like, when it comes to essential oils in general, like, I don't like that. That's not my area of expertise, and it's not necessarily something that I have a lot of insight into. And so I'm skeptical of a lot of the claims that come out of that space. However, I am really interested in some of these ideas that Will has been playing around with, and so I'll experiment with it, and I'll report back the next time we talk.
Yeah, sweet. So, what's going on at the Flow Research Collective? What are what's currently going on, and where are you heading? Can you give us an update on that?
Sure. Yes. So at the Flow Research Collective, we have two different aims, right? One is the training portion of the company, and the other is the research portion of the company. And so we were just in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, where we were doing our big trainer accelerator. So we actually rented out part of the Space Needle in Seattle, and we were doing trainings. Effectively, it's a bit of a train the trainer approach. And so we're taking people who are really interested in becoming flow trainers, flow coaches themselves, and giving them the tools to be really effective at doing that. And so there it was Stephen Kotler, myself, and Rianne. We were all there, as well as our team of who can only be described as a bunch of badass coaches. And so like, these are all people who are clinical psychologists or academic researchers, right? So they're all either, you know, clinical psychiatrists, PhDs, whatever else. And so we had that team of, let's see, I believe 5 or 6 different coaches at this point, who were all there with us. And so we were teaching a lot of the fundamentals of flow science, a lot of, you know, some of the new evolutions within it more recently. And then we're trying to make it insanely practical for people who are looking to take these to different clients, especially, you know, in either the executive coaching space or in athletics or in whatever other domain they look to apply it to. I think one person was looking at flow training very specifically for salespeople, right? And so people are becoming, people are kind of like carving out these very specific niches for themselves in a way that I think is really exciting. And so yeah, it was a really fun group to work with. And so
Do you feel like you get there also in like in ethical questions, like who do you want to teach this to, and what kind of things are they using it for?
I mean, I don't like, we haven't run into too many of the ethical questions yet. And so I think that, you know, in like, if you were to, I don't know, like be teaching a very specific like group of people who,
Let's say flow for arms dealers or something, you know?
yes, so we haven't taught flow for arms dealers just yet. I mean, it's a market that we're looking at expanding into. No, completely kidding. And so like the people who tend to be attracted to what we do are people who tend to be very into flow. And if you're into flow for long enough, you get into this autotelic personality, right? Where like you do things, you know, for the sake of doing those things. And so oftentimes like the way that, because those individuals are less externally motivated, and because they're much more motivated just out of, you know, the love of doing what they do, there is less of a tendency towards, I don't know, any sort of like nefarious weirdness. But that's not to say it can't happen at all. It's just we have like, you know, it's something that we're obviously cognizant of. I mean, we interview every single person who comes through any of our programs. And so we have an idea of where they're coming from. But generally, you know, the people that we interact with are already people who are, you know, not necessarily within some subset of people who are doing something that, you know, might be considered, you know, nefarious. And so we haven't run into that yet. And so we don't have, say, a systematic way of dealing with it other than conducting these interviews and making sure that the people that we speak with are, you know, have a good head on their shoulders. And so I think what we're more concerned of, rather than, you know, arms dealers making it into our courses, I think one of the things that we're more concerned about is, you know, people who might not have necessarily the maturity or the robustness of their personality to be able to deal with flow in a strong way. Because I mean, if you have pre-existing, you know, mental health issues, like that could be triggered by this environment. Like there are a number of different downsides that could possibly be triggered by more access to flow. And so we're mindful of those conditions. But ethically, I can't think of a single issue that we've had at all in, you know, anything that we've done. Whereas, you know, I've worked in, you know, Bay Area tech for, you know, a period of time now. And some of the stuff that I see happening there is, you know, a little bit, you know, ethically questionable. And so like, I do like, one of the things that I focus on is data science and artificial intelligence. And within that, you have to be very, very concerned about the ethical implications of what you're doing, because you can easily code all of your own biases into the algorithms that you're creating. And so you have to be very, very mindful of that. And so in the domain of flow science, yes, there's an issue of, you know, if you are to build communities around flow, they can very easily become something a little bit strange, right? Like they're a lot of cults are very, very good at leveraging group flow states. And so you do have to be mindful of that dimension. However, you know, what we're seeing right now isn't anywhere near that.
Physiology of flow. What are the newest findings on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's like the physiology of flow is a pretty complex equation. And so one of our main goals for 2020 is to drill down on the different dimensions of this. And so there's a wide array of research done on all these different physiological signatures, whether that's heart rate variability, respiration. And then within each one of those, they break down in all different ways. And so people are looking at if, say, you're doing some sort of task and it's challenging you versus threatening you, you can pull out the physiological signature of that as being distinct based upon the maximum heart output that you're giving, the maximum blood output that your heart is actually delivering. Like there are these very nuanced signatures that you can look at, whether it's if you're looking at your heart respiration, then if you're looking at any sort of brain signature, whether it's EEG, fMRI, whatever else, there's just a tremendous amount of complexity to all those different equations. And so for some of them, you'll see, say, an increase in heart rate variability generally correlates back to increased flow. But that's not the case in all different dimensions or all different types of flow. And so like being able to effectively strap a number of different sensors to you, keep track of all of these different metrics, and then create a larger analytical model for flow, that's something that we've been chasing for quite a while now. And so that's additional studies that are drilling down into those different metrics are one of our main focuses for the year. And there are so many really interesting ways that you can do this. And there's just an abundance of research out there, because all of this research goes back to, anything in psychology, basically, right? And so you're looking at, general issues of arousal. You're dealing with, issues of cognitive tasks. You're dealing with trying to differentiate how somebody responds when they're challenged versus how they respond when they've been challenged too much and suddenly they feel threatened. And so parsing out that equation is a pretty tricky one. And so one of our main goals for 2020 is to look at all of the different signatures, all of these different data points, and be able to really drill down into this quantitative assessment for how we can get a sense for when you're in flow. And once you have that model, you're starting to bridge the gap between psychology on the one hand, where we know a lot about the psychology of flow, and into the actual neuroscience, neurobiology, right? What's going on in your brain and your body when you're in flow. And so right now we have just a number of different disparate data points on this. We actually have a ton of different disparate data points on this, right? This has been a relatively well-studied thing, but trying to stitch all of this together is something that, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't been done in a rigorous way. I mean, so for instance, there's, one Norwegian professor who has, a really good model for facial micro expressions. And so what is the facial micro expression correlate back to flow? And so he'll have, a camera on you, and based upon what your facial micro expressions are doing, he claims that he can determine whether or not you're in flow. But that's just one dimension of this overall really complex equation. And so the goal of this year is to drill down into the complexity of that equation.
So what happens to people when they fall out of flow, or when they can't get back into it, when they're locked out of flow? Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, it's something you talked a little bit about the ethical implications of what we're doing. And I would say that this is one other ethical implication of what you're doing, which is if you have a very high flow lifestyle and you're used to getting into flow, at with some frequency, what happens when you're no longer able to access those states? And so oftentimes you see this in people who use risk as their flow trigger. And so for people who use risk as their flow trigger, they associate having more risk with their ability to get into flow. And so if they're locked out of flow, then, the logical assumption is that, oh, I need more risk in my life so that I can get into deeper flow. And that is a very perilous state to be in. And so part of, what we try and do when we train people into flow is, first off, even though many of us are involved in, action sports and other things that are, not something that we would necessarily recommend to other people, even though we're involved with that personally, I think being very upfront with the fact that the flow that you experience is independent of the task that you're in. And so when you set the stage up front, and you set the terms for how people understand flow, it's very important to say like, oh, this is independent of, you know, the groups that you're participating in, or the sport that you're engaging in, or the workplace culture that you're engaged in, or whatever else. I mean, this is something that has to do with your individual psychology and your biology. It doesn't have to do with the environment that you're in. And of course, you know, certain environmental preconditions are more conducive to flow, and you want to be able to leverage those, but you want to be able to divorce, you know, your flow activity from, you know, the psychology of flow, your subjective experience of flow. And so being upfront with that is incredibly important, right? You know, that's part of, you know, the I don't know, the ethically, you know, correct way of like approaching this, because otherwise, you know, oftentimes, like you see this with action sport athletes, where they'll have a period of time where they can't get into flow, and they get really, really concerned about it, right? Because that had become a really, really big part of their life, and then suddenly they're blocked out of it. And so you talk to like some of these individuals, and like there's a strong sense of anxiety that comes from them.
Mm-hmm.
And like being able to make the point that, you know, you can get into flow regardless of the environment that you're in, if you're used to something like action sports, which are, you know, and like you have many of those flow triggers baked into them. You might need something of a certain intensity to be able to find that state again. However, you know, it's completely possible, even if you are to leave the dangerous sport to do something a little bit less dangerous.
But would you say you would still need the typical flow triggers like flow follows focus and challenge skill ratio?
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's like challenging is for the challenge skill ratio in particular, the more challenge, the more skills that you have, the more likely you are to find flow. And so like in terms of the challenge skill balance, right? Like you want a amount of challenge that's proportionate to the amount of skill that you have. But as your skill gets stronger and stronger, and like as you retain that balance between challenge and skills, as your skills get stronger, your ability to get into flow goes up as well. And so if you're, you know, a athlete who's performing at their best in a given sport, and then suddenly you have an injury and you can no longer pursue that sport, like you're going to be locked out of flow until you can find another activity where your skill level is able to be at a comparable level. And so
Mm-hmm.
that takes quite a bit of investment and quite a bit of, you know, commitment to that idea, even when you don't necessarily have the quick rewards of like, oh, I just got back from, you know, this new activity and I didn't find flow today, but I'm, you know, going to muster the courage to go back and do it again tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I started two new activities recently. One is, do you know barre? I don't know how you say it in English, like Barre.
Yeah. So it's based on ballet, right?
Yeah, as a man to go there, I felt like a bit uncomfortable in the beginning, but it's actually quite fun. And where I go here, she's doing like a mix of Pilates and Pilates bar fusion. So I've been trying out that, and it's pretty intense workout actually, of like muscles I never felt before that I never knew I had them.
Yeah, so I have a friend who's an instructor for that, and it just seems, you know, like ballet's no joke, right? Like I'm not sure like how close like barre is connected to ballet, but you know that's, you know, a pretty rigorous form of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't think there's anything like, yeah, like I think it's a great activity to engage in. I mean, I was always attracted to gymnastics, because like gymnastics is, you know, somewhat similar. Like there's an aesthetic quality to what you're doing, but the way that you're interacting with your body and using your body is so distinct. And so that's one of the reasons why I was always attracted to CrossFit, is because CrossFit balances gymnastics with some of these other styles of exercise in a way that's actually quite rigorous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what was the second activity?
The second activity, and I thought about it would be pretty flowy, as doing pottery, you know, like throwing on like a table that spins. And I found this, yeah, Swiss master potter here in like two villages close to my village. And he's a pretty interesting guy. He's been doing pottery for like 45 years. He studied actually in Switzerland, but when he was young, he also moved to Japan to learn from Japanese potter masters. And it's mind blowing, like this whole topic of what he knows. It starts like with the whole chemistry of like how the different minerals work together and how like different fire temperatures make it look different, and he can explain every detail of it. Like he's a real master in it. And yeah, I've done it like twice now, like a one-on-one coaching with him for like 2 hours, and yeah, it's just so amazing. Like he takes my hand and then like works perfectly. And when I do it alone, it's like, okay, it's challenging, but I really get into it because it's spinning all the time, and you move your fingers like very slowly, and you create like shapes with it, and in the end you get like I don't know, like a glass or like a bowl, and it's a lot of fun. Yeah, I'll continue to work on it to get more into flow. I feel like I got a bit into it, but the challenge is still too high for my skill ratio. But he also said like usually like within like 10 hours or so people get it, so they can just do it on their own and just become better from that and just have fun with it. So I can recommend that to try it out, and I feel it's also super calming and zen somehow to just sit there and model this thing that's out of clay.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of pottery in the past, in part because where I went to undergrad had a relationship with a local pottery studio. And so you could go there and get an easy A. And so I did 2 different pottery classes. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it has many of the flow triggers there, right? So like immediate feedback is just like that when it comes to pottery, because if one slip of the hand and, you just messed up your bowl. And so like that's one dimension of it. But otherwise, there's a novelty to it. And, there's an embodied dimension to it as well. Because, you're interacting with like your body and your surroundings in a way that's like very, very novel to you. And so I like really, really enjoyed the pottery that I did. And so the first pottery class I took was for the easy A. The second pottery class I took was because I was actually really enjoying pottery.
Yeah, it's a beautiful art, and it's amazing what you can do with it. What are your talking about, what you do to get in flow? What do you do besides skydiving and base jumping? Do you have any daily routines to get yourself in flow?
Yeah, so like my daily routines, it depends on whether I'm traveling or whether I'm not traveling. Because I've actually been traveling quite a bit recently, and it's pretty challenging to keep a routine when you're traveling. And so that's been something that I've been spending a lot of time in working out. But my normal morning routine, if I'm home, is I always wake up at the same time each morning,
What
and then
time?
so I normally wake up at 6 a.m. So I wake up at 6, go directly into a 20-minute meditation, and then afterwards I'll go straight into a period of uninterrupted work time. And so so much of my life satisfaction is directly proportionate to whether or not I've had a 60 to 120-minute block of uninterrupted time. And it's funny how like if I feel a little bit off in the evening, it's oftentimes because I had some sort of meeting schedule that prohibited me from doing that. Um, and so I go directly into that 60 to 120-minute block of uninterrupted time. And then I normally have some sort of non-productive downtime afterwards. And so that's normally going for like some sort of walk where, I'm just kind of like letting things gestate, like, not necessarily focusing on any one thing in particular. And that's oftentimes, where like those aha insights come from, of like all of a sudden you just solved that problem that you were working on, and you were intensely focused on, and like you didn't quite get it, and then you go for a walk and you have some sort of creative insight that allows you to help rectify that. And so those are normally my mornings, and then my evenings are usually some sort of exercise. And so I got back into CrossFit maybe, let's say, 6 months ago, and that's just been a tremendous amount of fun. And so we always have this back and forth as to, how much exercise is like a good amount of exercise. Because if you're like really, really pushing yourself, that can be, overwhelming. You're drawing a lot of your resources in order to have that sort of, athletic engagement. And so theoretically, you should be having, a moderate amount of exercise, basically. but I enjoy high intensity interval training so much that, you know, I still engage in that activity. And I still find a tremendous amount of benefit to it. And so I think like if you engage in that, you just have to deal with like the initial down period of like, oh, I just like drew too many of my like energy resources. And then after a couple of weeks of stacking that up, you know, your body adapts and you're able to have more energy accessible to you effectively. And so my evenings are usually consistent of that style of exercise and then some sort of active recovery. And so for me, oftentimes that's reading, and then, you know, trying to shut down screens, you know, as early in the evening as possible.
That's the hardest for me.
It is really hard, right? Like if you have a lot of stimulation in your environment, it's hard to ramp up that stimulation, and then it's you know, hard to bring it back down as well.
I also feel like it's super hard to like not be productive. When I'm like, tonight I'll be like, oh cool, now I just recorded this interview with Conor, I gotta finish it. And actually I have an alarm set on my phone every day at 7:30. It says, turn all the screens off, meditate, be present. And I'm like, oh fuck, I just still want to cut this video, make the post-production, you know? That's the hardest thing. But then it's also, if I do it, it's so easy to get up at 5 a.m. It's so easy.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's so like being able to prioritize recovery is something that is just like, it's such a difficult thing to do, because you're like playing like this internal logic of like, okay, theoretically, I know that like, you know, my ability to exert effort is in proportion to how well I recover. And so like, theoretically, I know this, but like for anybody who's, you know, more goal oriented, it's always hard to tone that down in order to prioritize recovery.
Yeah.
But kind of the mantra that I like to use is a quote from a poem that I absolutely love, which says, it's both the fuel and the absence of fuel that makes fire burn. Mm-hmm. And I think kind of like focusing on that and being like, okay, like recovery is an essential part of this equation. And if you can gamify recovery, and that's one of the reasons why I love the Aura Ring, because with the Aura Ring, you're quantifying, you know, how well you recovered. And then all of a sudden, you know, that part of your brain that wants the goal orientation, that wants to be able to like derive productive value out of something, is satiated, because you're like, oh, I just recovered so hard. You know, I got like an 84, you know, readiness score, like on this app. That gives you some sort of motivation to do it. And so like, I think gamifying it is key, and that satiates the productive part of you for sure.
It's really nice when technology actually helps you to do this, either through the sleep score, the readiness score in Aura Ring, and or what I want to buy now, actually I want to buy this weekend, is a Muse headband, the second version of it, just to meditate more again, because you get the daily scores and also the gamification for daily meditation.
Right. Yeah, I'd be interested in your experience. I've used Muse on and off for a period of time. And since I was already meditating regularly at the time that I picked it up, I became a little bit less, like it did less for me, I would say.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to hear what your experience is.
Yeah, same. When I tried the first version, I was like, it's kind of fun, but I'm meditating anyways. And then it's like more distracting to do all the technology around it with the app and the sound. But in the last weeks, I found it actually hard to just sit down and meditate and also get deeper into it. So I thought like it would be definitely a help to get back into a daily or even like twice a day routine.
Right. And there are some interesting new features to that app. So for instance, there's, you know, a heart meditation as well. And so you can listen to your own heartbeat as you're meditating, which I actually really, really liked that feature, because it increases your amount of self-awareness in a really interesting way. And so you know that if you're in a meditative state, your heart rate variability is probably going up. And so your heart rate's going to increase a little bit as you inhale and decrease a little bit as you exhale. And so being able to have that immediate feedback where you can hear it, right? Like you could also put your finger on your pulse. And I know people who like meditate in that way as well. However, being able to actually like hear that is a really nice feature, because with the new Muse, they're doing a heart rate at your temple. And so they're able to capture that data, and they weren't before. And I think that's, you know, arguably a more insightful than some of the brain electrical activity that they're gathering.
Yeah, I'll try it out. Yeah, actually this morning I spent like the whole day until now not productive until our interview, and feel really good. Yeah, I've been working a lot in the last weeks, and this morning we got up at 6 a.m. even though it's Saturday, and we went up the mountain by car, just a 15-minute drive, and we watched the sunrise from the mountains, and there's like a little lake, and it was beautiful. We saw all the colors in the sky from like blue, yellow, pink. It's so beautiful. And my goal was just to be present with my girlfriend and just sit there for an hour and just really watch it. And yeah, it worked pretty well, but I could hear like my inner voice like, oh, you gotta record this. You gotta make like a cool video of it. And we had like all the camera gear with us and the drone. And so I was like, no, I just want to be present, because I felt like when I try to record too much of a like beautiful moment, I get out of the moment and I'm not really in it. So yeah, I just decided to just enjoy it and not record it and come back another day just to record it then. And afterwards we went to a wildlife park we have here on the mountain with some native wild animals we have here in Switzerland and Europe. It was pretty fun.
I'm envious of your lifestyle. That sounds great. but it's 100% true that like if you're taking photographs or you're recording, right? Like you're trying to represent that moment for a later moment, and so by definition you're not being present.
Right.
And so I think like it's funny, like like you see this trend in photography recently where like everybody's taking like selfies or like posed pictures, and like there's so many like fewer photographs you see of people just kind of like in motion, not actually aware of the fact that they're being photographed or whatever else. Whereas, a couple of years ago, like that wasn't the case. And I kind of I don't like that transition at all, right? Because, you're taking like a moment to like take the same picture that you've taken a million times like before, but just in front of a different object, right? Whereas, like the photographs that are most valuable to me are the ones that have like really shitty quality. However, like they represented this moment that you were engaged in what you were doing, and you just so happen to have like, this slice of self-awareness that somebody offered you by, having the foresight to take a photograph of it.
Right, like when I was jumping out of that airplane for the first time, I didn't think about how I look when you were just doing the video.
That was a tremendous amount of fun. I mean, so like first off, it's so exciting for me to be able to share those experiences with other people, because like very few people get to like actually go and skydive and like, experience those things. But like second, just like seeing your friends like up close when you're like flying in front of them and they're like on like their first skydive, it's just like it's so much fun. Yeah, it's a real treat for me. So like so thanks again for coming out. Like anytime
Sweet.
somebody like experiences that, I'm just absolutely love it.
Do you want to share anything more for this interview, for this video?
I'm happy to share a little bit more about what's happening on the research side of things as well. And so when we were in Seattle, we had our big research meeting to kind of plan out what the year was going to look like, what resources we have available to us, what the main priorities were. And so I mentioned some of the CBD studies that we're working on. And so the first of that is a surf study. Second, we're going to be using video gamers as our main reference case. And so we're going to be looking at video gamers while they're in flow and looking at all of the different physiological changes within them. And so that gives us, one coherent reference group that we can work with. They're somewhat static in the way that they're, interacting with their environment. There's a number of different, exclusionary criteria that you have to be very critical of. And that's, true of any study. But with video gamers, oftentimes they'll do this for just hours and hours and hours on end, right? And so you hear these people who are, gaming for over 24 hours straight. And so being able to vet the people who, sleep occasionally, that sort of thing is, of pretty high priority when it comes to that. But we'll be looking at video gamers and flow, quantifying a number of different, dimensions of, what's going on in their brain and their body when they're in that state. And then we'll likely be doing this with CBD as well. And so we'll have, gamers who are, going through whatever sessions, whatever their game of choice is. And we will likely be working with esports athletes. And so, people who are, professional gamers rather than, people who just came into a lab and they're playing Tetris, right? And so some of the research is on this. And like, I don't know about you, but I don't think I can get into flow when I play Tetris.
No.
and so like, using people who have like a high degree of skill that's balancing out the amount of challenge that they have is crucial. So we'll be looking at these populations with just a tremendous amount of different data points on what's going on in their brain and their body, and using this to start to build what is, the holy grail of this field, which is a biophysical flow detector, right? Which is the ability to, get a sense for how we can quantify these things in real time using consumer hardware in the lowest profile like way, so that you can start to build tools that allow you to modulate your environment, so in order to optimize for flow. And so imagine the next time you're doing pottery and, you're wearing a sensor, and like the speed at which that wheel is rotating is a function of like the feedback that we're getting from that device, right? So like, obviously the pottery market is pretty downstream for us, but that's the idea, right? Is, if you can modulate these inputs in real time using this physiology data, you're able to increase the level of flow and immersion that person experiences. And so like building this generalizable platform in order to accomplish this has been, something we've been working on for a while. And, we're really excited to be able to move that forward a little bit more in 2020.
It's super exciting. It would be so nice to, I don't know, have another ring on your hand and then the app, and it tells you, okay, do this, move faster, and you will be more in flow.
Right,
Super
exactly.
interesting. Yeah.
100%.
Sweet. Thank you for, sharing the updates from the world of flow research with us. And yeah, it was a pleasure to have this conversation with you as always.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And we'll talk again in maybe 6 months.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do another update in 6 months on what's going on in the flow world.
Fantastic. I'm down.